Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back for these cheery topics. I'm just going to very briefly introduce our panel, and then we're going to launch in. On the far end is Dan Reicher. Dan is the Director of Climate Change and Energy Initiatives for Google, and prior to that, taking that post about 2 years ago, he was president and co-founder of the New Energy Capital Corporation, a private equity fund that focused on investments in clean energy. Marianne Hitt, who is sitting in the middle, is director of the Sierra Club's National Coal Campaign, which, as I probably do not need to point out to you, is actually an anti-coal campaign. And prior to that, she was the executive director of Appalachian Voices, a regional environmental group that focused on issues affecting Appalachia, particularly mountaintop removal coal mining. And Jim Woolsey, who's sitting to my right here, has a CV way too long for me to go into, but some of the highlights include the fact that he is a former director of the CIA. He served as Undersecretary of the Navy and was an advisor on the U.S. delegation to the SALT talks in Vienna and Helsinki. And he is currently a venture partner at Vantage Point, a Silicon Valley clean tech venture capital firm, and the Annenberg Fellow at the Hoover Institution. So thanks you all for being here. I'm just going to start out by saying a tiny little thing, because this morning we talked a lot about the economy, which, the emergency aspect of that is clear to everyone, I think, and my panelists can correct me if they disagree with me, but I think there's sort of more of a gap between what people on sort of the inside of the climate and energy world think is an emergency, that we really don't have very much time to deal with the problem of climate change, and sort of what the public perception is out there. So I think everyone here is starting from the perception that we do have an emergency and that we have very little time to deal with these problems, so that they're very high stakes for the Obama administration, but please feel free to disagree if you want to. Yeah. Okay, so my very first question to all of you is if you could just name the one or two most important moves that the administration has made so far in the energy environment area, and then if you could also talk about, give them a good grade if you want, and also talk about the biggest missed opportunity that we've already seen from the administration that they've let go by. Dan,
I'd jump in to say that the stimulus bill, to me, was the single biggest step forward. As I've said to many people, the dog finally caught the car. We've been talking for decades about putting serious federal money into clean energy, and it's really been a drip year by year. I was Assistant Secretary of Energy under President Clinton, and the budget of my entire Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy was a little over $1 billion. The stimulus bill for clean energy is well in excess of $50 billion to be spent over 2 years. It's an extraordinary amount of money, and it will leverage an even larger amount of private sector investment in clean energy technologies and projects all across this country. And the good news is that the money's there. The challenge now is to spend it well and really make a difference in moving these technologies and projects forward. If I were to say one of the things that concerns me is the other big thing happening in Washington right now, which is the climate and energy legislation, a 648-page bill that is pending in the House of Representatives. Very important legislation to move forward to both put a cap on climate emissions and also to start putting a real solid floor under clean energy like wind and solar and geothermal. The good news is that it's a good bill. The bad news is that I think it's got real rough sledding ahead to actually be adopted. So I think there's a real high and not a low, but a question mark. The one final point I'd make is that EPA has said that if Congress doesn't get around to regulating carbon emissions, that the agency has the authority to do so and will step in. So that's a real forcing function.
And I would name that as possibly the most significant thing to date in the first 100 days is on April 17th, the EPA came out with this finding that global warming pollution does pose a threat to public health and welfare. And this was authorized by a 2007 Supreme Court decision that said EPA has this authority to regulate global warming pollution. They don't have to wait for Congress. And this endangerment finding was the first step. Just to compare that to the past 8 years, according to the New York Times, when the EPA under the Bush administration proposed this endangerment finding, supposedly the White House, is that on? Is that coming through?
Jim, is your mic on?
Mine is, I think.
We have some tech person. Okay.
Jim is an innovative fellow.
I'm not sure what's going on, but
This is the problem with technology. This is why you need a stimulus.
1, 2, 3.
It's not.
They can't hear me. We're going to be good friends when it's over. Supposedly the Bush administration, the White House didn't even open the email that included this endangerment finding. And what this does is it sets the stage for EPA to regulate global warming pollution from our two biggest sources, which are cars and coal plants. And we know that if the Congress doesn't manage to push through this global warming bill that is essential, frankly, to the survival of the future of life on Earth, that we get this right, EPA does have the power, and it's going to be a very important over the next 100 days to see, one, if this global warming legislation can make it through, and then if not, all eyes will be on the Obama administration and the rules that could follow from this endangerment finding. You can have that.
I agree with Dan very much that the stimulus package presents us an extraordinary opportunity to move quickly on some things like renewables. Because it is a stimulus for the economy, however, it's going to be important to focus as much as possible on things that employ people right away and still take advantage of the opportunity to move toward less carbon production from electricity or from automobiles. I think that probably means up front a lot of things like building modifications and maybe solar panels on roofs and the like. But over the long run, that amount of money, some of it going for R&D, even though it's part of a stimulus package, I think is going to be hugely important. In missed opportunities, I don't know if it's an opportunity or not, but I think it's something that's been missed by a lot of people, including in the administration, that needs to get fixed. The climate change debate is what it is, in part because a lot of people don't understand that CO2 is so persistent in the atmosphere, lasting for hundreds of years, that it's a completely different kind of problem than when we were clearing up pollution, sulfur dioxide or something like that. You can clear up ozone or sulfur dioxide and see the results relatively quickly. Here, you're talking about reducing the amount of, in a sense, water that's going into the bathtub, but the bathtub is still there very full, and it's the problem, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. The other thing is that people need to understand that climate change doesn't occur in a single straight line. It doesn't matter if this winter is cooler than last winter. It goes in a scattered pattern, and I mean, that's why regressions exist, so people can fit scattergrams to tendencies. And those 2 points are really missed in the public debate, and a lot of people who are skeptical about climate change, some of them are so for their own economic reasons, some of them just are never going to believe in anything like this, but a lot of them really don't understand. And I think we could do with a presidential tutorial or something on climate change that doesn't just state conclusions, but explains to people why it is as serious an issue.
And don't understand, but also, and therefore, to a large extent, don't really place a high priority on fixing the problem. I think the recent news is that climate change ranks near the bottom of the list of people's priorities. So part of that education is, in fact, to impress upon the public that there's a reason to worry.
Mm-hmm. Dan, you brought up the Markey-Waxman bill, and just for a quick a recap of that, this is a bill that would impose a cap on aggregate carbon emissions in the country, and then there would institute what is called a cap and trade system. We may see a lot of action on that bill. It may even go to markup pretty soon. And a lot of people are pinning their hopes on that. And yet, as you mentioned, it seems to be in for some pretty rough sledding. I think that does raise the question, where is the administration? I mean, do we need the administration really to weigh in on this bill more than it's doing? What do you see? What does everybody see as their strategy? And do they have a strategy? And how's it playing out?
Oh, I think it's clear, that this is a top priority for the administration, and the administration is working hard on it. I think this is a matter of, a whole range of members of Congress who have issues with it, Republicans and a fairly large number of Democrats too, looking at what they see as the costs imposed by this cap and trade program on their constituents, on electricity ratepayers, and they're saying, we can't afford this. Now, there's first a lot of debate about those numbers, and secondly, there's a lot of good arguments to be made that we can't afford not to take this step, and in fact, there are ways to take these steps, for example, major investments in energy efficiency that will, in fact, reduce what people have to pay for energy in a very significant way. And there are ways to green up our energy supply in cost-effective ways. And putting a cap on emissions, in fact, will cause those costs to go down. So, but this is a very spirited debate in Washington, and as I say, there are a group of moderate Democrats, particularly from the Midwest and the South, who have serious problems with this bill, and trying to get the politics to align there in the House is hard. It's probably going to be even harder in the Senate. The good news is there's a second half to this bill, which is all about energy. For example, putting a national standard in place for renewable energy, ratcheting up our use of solar and wind and geothermal to 25% of our electricity mix by 2020, putting a national standard in place for energy efficiency. So we may actually see pieces of this legislation actually adopted, while the climate portion, now too controversial potentially, ultimately fails, but eventually will get adopted. I don't think there's any doubt we're going to put controls on climate emissions. The question is how fast we're going to get to it. And I think we still have a shot in this Congress, but it may go over to the next.
And it's also important to note that, the administration has made it clear that this is one of their top priorities, along with fixing the economy and fixing healthcare. And the coal industry is spending 3 times more in Washington this year than they spent last year. It's the single largest source of global warming pollution in this country. They know that they're fighting for their life, and the politics around this are very much being distorted by the disproportionate weight that they're throwing around and money that they're throwing around, and it's making it much more difficult. And so the Obama administration, I think, is showing the leadership that they can, given all of the numerous crises that they have on their hands. But make no mistake, in our view, the coal industry wants to be sure that they continue to provide, to be the major source of electricity in this country, and they want to lock up that market share. They're not sitting idly by waiting for clean energy to have an upsurgence and start supplying a lot more of our energy needs. So this is a real battle going on, and the coal industry is fighting for its life.
That's right. And we would be able, with a well-designed cap-and-trade system, to penalize essentially heavily carbon-emitting sources such as coal, and over time shift the way electricity is generated. The problem comes with designing a cap-and-trade system which takes account of the political realities by perhaps giving away some of the credits, but not going as far as the Europeans, who gave away all of the CO2 credits, and therefore had CO2 priced at under €1 per ton for several years. It was basically a joke. They've now started to try to work on it to fix it, but they formally had a cap-and-trade system, but it wasn't one that accomplished anything. So in trying to take some of these social costs of climate change and pollution and so forth and turn them into real dollar and cents costs, people are going to have to spend more money. And the Democratic congressmen and senators from the coal states are fighting rather hard on this, as are the coal. As is the coal lobby itself. There's one other thing I want to mention. We basically don't use oil anymore to produce electricity. About 2% of the country's electricity comes from oil. Back in the 1970s, it was up around 20%. So back then, if you shifted from away from using oil to produce electricity, if you built a nuclear power plant or even in those days a wind farm or whatever, you were doing something about oil consumption. Today, by fixing the CO2 emissions problem, or partially fixing it, moving toward fixing it with a cap and trade system that focuses on emissions, you do a little bit to help us move away from oil, but not a lot. $1 a ton of CO2 in the market is about a penny at the pump. So a $30 a ton CO2 price means about 30 cents additional cost for your gasoline. That's not enough to have an effect. You have to take other steps to move us away from oil, which is slightly smaller than coal as a climate changing substance, but is in international political terms a real problem. As Tom Friedman says, what we have is a policy to fill her up with dictators.
You know, we've been talking about the domestic situation, but this is a big year on the international scene. There's going to be a big negotiating session where high-level ministers from all around the world are going to show up in Copenhagen in November and supposedly hammer out an international agreement. And Hillary Clinton has said just the other day, and I quote, "The U.S. is ready to lead and determined to make up for lost time." But what does she have to bring to Copenhagen? What does U.S. leadership on this issue means after really, as I think Jeffrey Sachs said this morning, we've really done nothing on this issue. So we don't have much time to show leadership here. Dan, what do you think she has to bring to Copenhagen to show leadership, and how likely is that?
Well, the Markey-Waxman bill in and of itself is a very significant piece of legislation.
But we're not sure we're going to get the Markey, right?
We may not get it, but we definitely can demonstrate some progress having put together this pretty smart cap-and-trade approach and linked it to a smart set of energy provisions. And, we'll probably get a vote. We may lose, but we'll have a significant number of members of the House of Representatives on record in favor of that, number one. Number two, as we discussed, we've got EPA stepping out very clearly to say, Capitol Hill, if you don't get around to regulating CO2 emissions, we're going to do it. And we know how to regulate emissions. And it'll take us a few years to write the regulations, but we know how to do it, and we can get this job done if we have to. So I actually think that's something fairly significant to take to Copenhagen. Plus, I do think just the practical progress and leadership we're showing on energy, the stimulus money, for example, if we spend that the right way in some critical areas, that'll demonstrate great leadership. The push we're finally making to take advantage of our cheapest, fastest, and best energy source, which is energy efficiency, it's a real sea change between last year and this year, the attention we're giving to that. Last year we were spending $100 million to $200 million a year on the low-income home weatherization program. The stimulus is going to spend $5 billion a year. We're going to weatherize over 1 million homes, low-income homes, instead of 100 or 200,000. Very aggressive standards are going to be set for the energy efficiency of appliances. I have to say, my favorite day in the Clinton administration, we were issuing new standards for the efficiency of refrigerators, not the most exciting topic in the world to get people's attention. And we were going to improve the efficiency of refrigerators by 35%. And the Secretary of Energy at the time, Bill Richardson, the former UN ambassador, looked at me as he was stepping out on stage and he said, "Reicher, what should I announce?" And I thought to myself, a week earlier, President Clinton had given his second inaugural address about building a bridge to the 21st century. And I said, "Mr. Secretary, why don't you announce we're building a fridge to the 21st century?" It was the quote of the week in Newsweek. It was on the front page of the New York Times. It was definitely the high point of my career as a bureaucrat. So anyway, energy efficiency is not only boring, but it's fun.
Anyone else want to?
Well, in a recent article, Secretary of State Clinton cited the endangerment finding as the single most significant thing that this country has done to show that we're serious about global warming. And there will be a series of other rules that are going to be coming out, some of which are directly related to global warming, some of which are internalizing some of the free rides that the coal industry, for example, has had for several years. One of the first actions that President Obama took after taking office was to allow California to set global warming pollution standards for cars, which is something they've been trying to do for years. The EPA has made it pretty clear that they're going to set mercury regulations for coal plants, which to date are the single largest unregulated source of mercury in this country. They're the one industry that still has no mercury limits. We also are expecting rules on the disposal of coal ash. We're expecting possible rules on mountaintop removal coal mining. So going to Copenhagen with a series of things that we've done to make coal pay its fair share and then start tackling CO2 with endangerment and hopefully some CO2 rules to follow, those would be significant steps. But Obama is not going to be able to do those things without a lot of support from the public because clearly there's going to be a lot of opposition, and that's where my friend Van Jones, one of the quotes of his that I really like is that President Obama is not going to save you. You are going to have to save President Obama. And we can't look to him to be in the White House while we all step back and wait for these magical things to happen. He's going to require a lot of public support to really move this forward.
I just want to say one thing, which is that ultimately the leadership that we show that will really change things is in technology. We still invent things pretty well in this country. And we will not be able, through the cleverest diplomacy and the most legislation we pass ourselves or in any other way, to convince China to stop building coal-fired power plants and as part of a cap-and-trade system unless there's some other technology that makes coal-fired power plants obsolete. And the two areas of technology that I see moving the fastest right now in this whole area are solar and batteries, storage of electricity. Storage completely changes the game with respect to electricity. And although it won't help us at Copenhagen, because it's not going to be soon enough, anything we can do to move some of these technologies along the way that are going to be more attractive to foreign countries, rather than making them choose, even indirectly, between prosperity and pollution, we've got to work to maintain our technological lead in these areas.
Yeah, and I would echo that. It's really quite critical, the technology part of this piece. And we were talking before the session, and Jim's favorite is solar linked to batteries. My favorite is advanced geothermal, not traditional geothermal where you drill and find a little pocket of steam or hot water. That's a good technology, but literally if you drill anywhere on this planet deep enough, half a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, you get to hot rock. And the oil industry knows how to fracture that rock. You can put water down, bring it back up, make steam, turn a turbine and make electricity. And this is a technology that we don't lead the world in. The Australians do, and there's projects operating now in Europe. But we're catching up fast. The stimulus has $400 million in it for this kind of work. And we have a bunch of venture-backed companies in the U.S. now pursuing this. So many technological opportunities, and I completely agree with Jim that that's really going to be the key. If we're going to wean not only ourselves, but the Chinese, the Indians, and others off of coal, there's got to be a cost-effective alternative. The beauty of geothermal is that it's 24/7. It's what we call base load power.
But I noticed that neither of you mentioned carbon capture and storage, which was mentioned this morning by Jeffrey Sachs as, sort of the only hope, because China, I think, gets something like 80% of its electricity from coal right now. Is that right? So, I guess it's pretty low down your list, all of you. Is that a unanimous?
Well, it's pretty low down.
I guess someone should explain exactly what it is.
Well, what you're talking about is capturing the CO2 that comes out of a coal-fired power plant. We kind of know how to do that now with a process called integrated gasification combined cycle. We can capture the CO2. It adds maybe 25, 30% or something to the cost of the coal-fired power plant. The question is, what do you do with it? You can sequester it. You can put it For a little bit of it, you can put it down oil wells and do tertiary recovery, or you can put it into, you need CO2 for
Pepsi.
Soft drinks and so forth. There's some things you can do, but if
Pepsi,
you're
right.
talking about the volume that one would need to do from coal-fired power plants, it's huge, and so you have to find some way to sequester a huge amount of carbon dioxide in the earth. What has generally been suggested is to drill down pretty deeply into the distances that we were talking about a minute ago, a mile or two, and put it into or even under the very deep saline aquifers that are down at those depths pretty much all over the world. In order to do that, you've got to get the CO2 to the well, and that means pipelines of CO2. So you're talking about a very large infrastructure investment. It may be something that we have to do. I don't think we should say don't work on it. I think we should do some serious work on it. But compared to some of the other alternatives, whether it's geothermal or solar and batteries, I'm skeptical that it's going to be the answer.
And just to put this in context for folks, when Vice President Cheney's Energy Task Force proposed what eventually became 200 proposed new coal-fired power plants across this country, the Sierra Club decided we were going to oppose every single one of them unless they were true demonstrations for carbon capture and storage, of which we were able to identify one, which was FutureGen, which eventually didn't get built because the economics didn't add up. I am pleased to report that we have been able to stop, with lots of allies around the country, 97 proposed coal-fired power plants all over this country, amounting to avoiding 380 plus million tons of annual CO2 emissions, and hopefully providing some more market share for these truly clean forms of energy. But what we've seen on the ground, the kinds of coal plants that are being proposed, don't intend to capture or sequester their carbon. They're 19th century pulverized coal technologies. And we know that the distance from where we are now with coal burning technology and where we would need to be with carbon capture and storage, I've heard 10 to 20 years to know if it's viable. On 60 Minutes on Sunday, Jim Rogers said it would be 40 or 50 years before we could really determine if this was going to be the solution on the scale we need or not. And we do not have that kind of time with global warming. A Berkeley scientist who works on this a lot has said it would cost $1 trillion and would require the equal amount of infrastructure of the whole oil drilling infrastructure on the planet to capture and sequester our CO2 in this country on the scale that would solve the problem. So I definitely feel that energy efficiency, a lot of these really exciting new technologies that we're talking about, are the best investment of our time and energy when we have a very short window. I also think it's very real. We're still fighting 60 proposed coal plants. The coal industry is trying to lock up that remaining market share. And carbon capture and sequestration, I think, is more of a marketing slogan and a distraction than a real solution at this point.
And I also noticed that nuclear was not on any of your lists. Now, wherever I go these days, people ask me, is nuclear our solution? Why was that not on your list?
Well, it's also quite low on mine. I wouldn't say it's absolutely at zero, because the costs keep going up and the subsidy requirements are huge for the federal government to insure nuclear power plants, since the market won't insure them, and to guarantee the loans. The Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovins' institution, puts out publications on the costs of nuclear, and they just keep going up and up and up and up and up. However, operating a nuclear power plant is, compared to the whole cycle, emits some carbon from mining uranium and so forth, but operating the power plant does not emit CO2, and that's good. The real problem, I think, with nuclear is that although we could probably in this country get ourselves organized to figure out how to what to do with the spent fuel and so forth, once you get into a movement to add nuclear power plants, the companies that do it are going to want to sell abroad. And light water reactors of the sort that we have now are deploying them around the world is sort of like being a Johnny Appleseed of nuclear weapons. Because you cannot, with the existing treaty, keep people from getting into the fuel cycle if they have a nuclear power plant for electricity production. Can't keep them from enriching uranium and reprocessing plutonium. And once they get into that, they can get very far along the way to having a nuclear weapon, as North Korea and Iran have shown. So I think it's a serious proliferation problem to turn toward nuclear power. It's not unimaginable that one could have an entire new international regime in which the United Nations reprocessed all the fuel or something. But I once negotiated a 23-nation treaty, and it ain't easy. And a 192-nation treaty controlling the way everybody deals with nuclear power strikes me as an extraordinary diplomatic effort.
We did a brief study at Google looking out at 2030 and what the electricity mix might look like, and actually have assumed that nuclear will stay about where it is at around 20% of U.S. electricity. A few old plants will get shut down, a few new plants will get built, but we don't see it as any big changes. There's a real issue beyond the proliferation issue that Jim just raised. I was a staff member of President Carter's commission on the accident at 3 Mile Island, and one of the things that impressed me working on that commission was this is a peculiar technology in that one single accident can set back an entire industry for a generation. And that's really what happened in this country. And if we were to have an accident, I think the public support, which has actually been on the rise for nuclear, would be set back again. Unlike, a coal-fired power plant burns up or a wind turbine falls down, that's a week in the news and it's gone. A nuclear accident is different. For me, and I think heard it from my colleagues up here as well, energy efficiency is really, as I said, the low-hanging fruit. And it's a low-hanging fruit that grows back. The incandescent light bulb you replace with a compact fluorescent, you're going to replace again in a few years with yet another technology. We're working on a product at Google that will be out soon. It'll be a piece of free software you'll download on your smartphone or your laptop, and it will give you real-time information about energy use in your home, either linked to a smart meter that's installed on your home or a simple little gizmo that you put near your fuse box. The data is quite clear. You give people real-time information about their own electricity use, you immediately cut, simply based on behavioral changes, you cut people's electricity use 5 to 15%. You go on from there and replace that inefficient refrigerator or upgrade the air conditioner, you get into the 20, 30, 40% range. So we have a terrific opportunity there. One quick story. A colleague of mine who's installed this little piece of software in his apartment just discovered the other day that he was paying for the washer and dryer use for his entire apartment building. There's no way he would otherwise have known this. He kept saying, everything is off in my apartment, and I keep seeing this. He didn't know what was happening, but of course he's paying for everybody's washer and dryer. So
I had that same landlord when I was in Boston.
It's not just good for the planet.
That's right.
So we're running low on time. So I have my bottom line. I think it would be good to end on a predictive note, so we can sort of put our money where our mouths are, or whatever. When we meet, we were to reconvene this panel 4 years from now. What will have happened? And the bottom line being, will carbon emissions from the U.S. be higher or lower at 2012 when Barack Obama either is taking the oath of office again or is out on his rump?
Ooh, question. I think we will have adopted cap and trade legislation 4 years from now. So at least the long-term trajectory will be down. I think whether carbon emissions are up or down will depend a lot on, frankly, where the economy is at that point. But I think the good news 4 years from now is that we will have adopted legislation, and the longer-term trajectory will, in fact, be down.
We just crossed a threshold recently where we now have more jobs, close to getting to more jobs in the wind industry than the coal industry, believe it or not. I think that we're going to see those trends continue. I am very hopeful that at least we will have figured out how to level out our CO2 emissions. I mean, we've actually seen a decline in energy use and CO2 emissions because of this recession, which is not the kind of measures that anyone is obviously supporting. But it does depend very much on what happens in the economy, and I'm very optimistic that we'll at least be leveled out.
Well, nearly 40% of our CO2 emissions are from oil, and oil dominates transportation. We can make some real progress on that side of things if we can do to oil what my sometime colleague Annie Coren calls to the same thing that was done to salt at the end of the 19th century by electricity. Salt was a strategic commodity until around the end of the 19th century because it was the only way to preserve meat. Countries went to war over salt mines. The coming of the electric grid changed all that in a relatively few years, and salt is now boring. We need to make oil equally boring.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.